There's a moment that defines every catastrophic coaching hire. For one Raiders coach, that moment came in the middle of a team meeting when he screamed at his players, called them the dumbest team in America, and then walked out of the room, leaving his assistant coaches to clean up the damage. For another, he came when the owner held a press conference specifically to humiliate him while he was still employed, listing his failures on national television with the coach sitting in the audience. And for one particularly disastrous hire, the defining moment came when he was fired via FaceTime while eating lunch at a sandwich shop, 9 games into his second season, having destroyed a franchise that had taken decades to build. Tonight, I'm going to count down the 10 worst coaching hires in Oakland Raiders history. These are not just bad coaches who posted losing records. These are men who fundamentally broke the franchise, who created dysfunction that lasted years beyond their tenure, who set the Raiders back so far that the scars are still visible today. But I need to warn you about something before we begin. Some of these stories are going to make you angry. Some will make you laugh at the absurdity, and some will make you question how a franchise with such a proud history could make such catastrophically bad decisions. By number one, you will understand why the Raiders spent nearly 2 decades wandering in the wilderness, and you will know exactly who to blame. Let me start at number 10 and work toward the disaster that still defines this franchise's darkest era.
Number 10, Eddie Erdelatz, 1960 to 1961. Eddie Erdelatz was the first head coach in Oakland Raiders history. He took over an expansion franchise in 1960 with 0 talent, 0 resources, and 0 chance of immediate success. In 2 seasons, Erdelatz went 6-10. The team was outmatched physically. They lost games by embarrassing margins. Fans stopped showing up to games because watching the Raiders was painful. Erdelatz was fired after the 1961 season. He never coached in professional football again. Now, I have placed Erdelatz at number 10, not because he was incompetent, but because he represents the beginning of something important. He established that the Raiders would not tolerate losing, that failure would not be accepted, regardless of circumstances. This standard, while admirable, would later create problems when owners made impulsive decisions based on short-term results rather than long-term planning. But Erdelatz deserves credit for one thing. He helped establish the Raiders as a franchise that demanded excellence, even when excellence was impossible to achieve with the roster he inherited.
Number 9, Bill Callahan, 2002 to 2003. Wait, I know what you were thinking. Bill Callahan took the Raiders to a Super Bowl in his first season. How can he be one of the worst coaches in franchise history? Let me explain. Bill Callahan inherited a team built by John Gruden, a roster loaded with Hall of Fame talent, an offense that had been perfected over 4 years, a culture of winning that was already established. All Callahan had to do was not destroy what Gruden had built. He could not even manage that. The 2002 Raiders went 11-5 in the regular season. They demolished the Jets and Titans in the playoffs. They reached Super Bowl 37. And then Callahan did something that Raiders players still cannot forgive. The night before the Super Bowl, he changed the game plan. According to Tim Brown and Jerry Rice, 2 Hall of Fame receivers who were in that locker room, Callahan scrapped significant portions of the offensive strategy they had practiced for 2 weeks and installed a pass-heavy approach that played directly into Tampa Bay's defensive strengths. The result was a 48-21 massacre. Reach Gannon threw 5 interceptions, 3 returned for touchdowns. The Raiders' offense looked confused and unprepared on the biggest stage in professional football. After the Super Bowl, multiple players accused Callahan of sabotage. Tim Brown said publicly that he believed Callahan hated the Raiders and deliberately called plays designed to lose. Whether this is true or not, the fact that Hall of Fame players believed it tells you everything about Callahan's relationship with the locker room. The following season, the Raiders went 7-9. Callahan was fired.
His tenure lasted 2 seasons and produced one of the most humiliating losses in franchise history.
Number 8. Mike White, 1995 to 1996. Mike White was hired to bring discipline to a Raiders team that had become chaotic under previous leadership. He was a defensive coordinator with a reputation for toughness. But toughness without competence is just cruelty. White's defenses were aggressive but unsophisticated. They blitzed constantly without regard for situation or opponent. They gave up big plays at crucial moments. They made mediocre quarterbacks look like Hall of Famers. In 2 seasons, White went 15-17. The team regressed under his leadership. Players who had been productive under previous coaches struggled in White's system. By the end of his 2nd season, White had lost the locker room. Players stopped listening to him. Veterans questioned his decisions openly. The franchise was in chaos. Al Davis fired him after the 1996 season. White never got another head coaching job in the NFL.
Number 7. Norv Turner, 2004 to 2005. Norv Turner was supposed to be the answer. He was an offensive genius who had coordinated successful attacks in Dallas and Washington. He understood passing schemes. He knew how to develop quarterbacks. The problem was that Turner arrived in Oakland at exactly the wrong time. The Super Bowl roster from 2002 had aged out. The salary cap was a disaster. The talent pipeline had dried up completely. Turner inherited a mess and made it worse by refusing to adapt. He installed a complex offensive system that required precision timing and elite quarterback play. The Raiders had neither. Their quarterbacks were a rotating cast of veterans past their prime and young players who were not ready. In 2 seasons, Turner went 9-23. The offense that was supposed to be his strength ranked near the bottom of the league in both years. The defense, which received minimal attention, was even worse. Al Davis fired Turner after the 2005 season. Turner would later find success as an offensive coordinator in San Diego, which only made his Raiders tenure look worse in retrospect.
Number 6. Tom Cable, 2008 to 2010. Tom Cable's tenure as Raiders head coach was defined by chaos, both on and off the field. On the field, Cable's teams never had a winning record. They went 17-27 in 3 seasons. The offense was predictable, the defense was soft, and the special teams were a disaster. But it was the off-field controversies that made Cable's tenure truly memorable for all the wrong reasons. In 2009, Cable allegedly assaulted assistant coach Randy Hansen during a meeting, breaking Hansen's jaw. The incident was investigated by police, but Cable was never charged. The NFL conducted its own investigation and found no conclusive evidence, but the shadow of the allegation hung over Cable for the rest of his time in Oakland. Additionally, Cable's ex-wife accused him of domestic violence in court documents. Cable denied the allegations and was never convicted of any crime, but the accusations created a toxic environment around the franchise. On the field, Cable's coaching was equally problematic. He had no clear offensive identity. He constantly changed quarterbacks without giving any of them a fair chance to succeed. He made baffling in-game decisions that cost the Raiders winnable games. Al Davis stuck with Cable longer than he should have, perhaps because finding a replacement was difficult given the franchise's reputation. But after the 2010 season, even Davis had seen enough. Cable was fired and eventually found work as an offensive line coach, the position he should have stayed in his entire career. Number 5. Joe Bugel, 1997. Joe Bugel's tenure as Raiders head coach lasted exactly 1 season. One catastrophically bad season. Bugel was hired because of his reputation as an offensive line coach. He'd been part of successful staffs in Washington and Philadelphia. Al Davis believed Bugel could build a physical running game and restore toughness to a franchise that had gone soft. Instead, Bugel proved that being a great position coach does not mean you will be even an adequate head coach. The 1997 Raiders went 4-12. They were outscored by over 100 points.
They lost games in ways that suggested fundamental incompetence rather than simple talent deficiencies. Bugel's game management was atrocious. He made terrible decisions on fourth down. He mismanaged the clock constantly. He seemed overwhelmed by the responsibilities of being a head coach. After one season, Al Davis fired Bugel and admitted the hire had been a mistake. Bugel returned to being an offensive line coach and never sought another head coaching position.
Number 4. Dennis Allen, 2012 to 2014. Dennis Allen was hired to bring defensive expertise to a Raiders team that had been awful on that side of the ball for years. He was young, intelligent, and came highly recommended from his time as defensive coordinator in Denver. But Allen was completely unprepared for the challenges of being a head coach. In 3 seasons, Allen went 8-28. That is a winning percentage of .222. He never won more than 4 games in a season. His teams were not just bad, they were historically terrible. The 2013 Raiders allowed over 500 points, the most in franchise history. The defense that Allen was supposed to fix became the worst in the NFL. The offense, which received minimal attention, was equally inept. But what made Allen's tenure truly painful was how quickly his teams quit. Multiple times during his tenure, the Raiders were blown out by 30 or 40 points. Players stopped fighting. The effort was not there. Reggie McKenzie, the general manager who hired Allen, admitted later that the roster was so devoid of talent that no coach could have succeeded. But Allen's inability to develop young players or create any semblance of competitiveness made a bad situation worse. He was fired 4 games into the 2014 season after an embarrassing loss to the Miami Dolphins. His tenure represents the absolute bottom of the Raiders' modern era. Number 3. Art Shell, 2006. Art Shell is a Raiders legend. As a player, he was one of the greatest offensive linemen in NFL history. He is in the Hall of Fame. He won multiple Super Bowls. He embodied everything the silver and black represented. But his second stint as head coach in 2006 was a complete disaster. Shell had coached the Raiders from 1989 to 1994 with mixed results. When Al Davis brought him back in 2006, it was a nostalgia hire designed to restore the franchise's identity. Instead, it produced one of the worst seasons in NFL history. The 2006 Raiders went 2-14. They were outscored by over 200 points. They lost games by margins that suggested they did not belong on the same field as their opponents. But the offense was where things got truly horrifying. The Raiders averaged just 10.4 points per game. 10.4. They scored more than 20 points only twice all season. They were shut out twice. They committed 53 turnovers. Art Shell's offense was so inept that opposing defenses played with absolute confidence that Oakland could not score. Teams loaded the box against the run, knowing the Raiders could not pass. They blitzed constantly, knowing the offensive line could not protect. Shell was fired after 1 season. He never coached again, and his legacy as a player is forever tainted by what happened in 2006. Number 2. Josh McDaniels, 2022 to 2023. Josh McDaniels arrived in Las Vegas with enormous expectations. He had been Bill Belichick's offensive coordinator in New England. He was considered an offensive genius. He was supposed to modernize the Raiders and turn them into contenders. Instead, he destroyed everything in less than 2 seasons. McDaniels went 9-16 as Raiders head coach, but the record does not capture the full scope of the damage he caused. He inherited a playoff team. The 2021 Raiders had gone 10-7 and made the postseason despite mid-season chaos that included the resignation of head coach John Gruden. McDaniels tore that roster apart. He traded away or released players who did not fit his system. He brought in his own guys, most of whom failed spectacularly. The culture that had been carefully built over several years disintegrated in months.
Star wide receiver Davante Adams, who had demanded a trade to Las Vegas specifically to play with his college quarterback Derek Carr, watched in horror as McDaniels benched and then released Carr mid-season. Adams publicly expressed frustration with the direction of the franchise. Reports emerged that he wanted out of Las Vegas. The locker room fractured. Players stopped believing in what McDaniels was selling. On the field, the results were equally bad. The offense that McDaniels was supposed to fix ranked in the bottom third of the league. His play calling was predictable. His adjustments were inadequate. He lost games that competent coaching would have won. After starting the 2023 season 3-13, McDaniels was fired. Not at the end of the season, not during the bye week. 9 games into his second year, the Raiders decided they could not tolerate him any longer. He was eating lunch when he received a call. He was fired via phone. The humiliation was complete. McDaniels represents everything wrong with modern NFL coaching hires. A coordinator elevated beyond his abilities. A system guy who could not adapt when his system failed. A leader who destroyed a locker room and was fired before he could do further damage. But as bad as McDaniels was, he is not number 1 on this list. Because there is one Raiders coaching hire so catastrophically bad, so dysfunctional, so damaging to the franchise, that it deserves a category of its own.
Number 1, Lane Kiffin, 2007 to 2008. Lane Kiffin was 31 years old when Al Davis hired him to coach the Oakland Raiders. He had never been a head coach at any level. He had coordinated an offense at USC for 1 season. He was young, unproven, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Al Davis hired Kiffin because he believed young coaches brought energy and innovation. He wanted someone who could relate to modern players. He wanted a fresh approach. What he got was a public disaster that embarrassed the franchise for 2 years. Kiffin went 5-15 in less than 2 seasons. But again, the record does not tell the full story. From the moment Kiffin was hired, his relationship with Al Davis was toxic. Davis wanted control over personnel decisions. Kiffin wanted input. Davis wanted a vertical passing attack. Kiffin wanted to establish the run. Davis wanted veteran quarterbacks. Kiffin wanted to develop young talent. Every decision became a battle. Every disagreement became public. The franchise descended into civil war with the owner and coach on opposite sides. And then came the press conferences. In September 2008, Al Davis held one of the most bizarre press conferences in NFL history. With Lane Kiffin still employed as head coach, Davis stood at a podium and listed Kiffin's failures. He read from prepared remarks detailing how Kiffin had lied to him, defied him, and embarrassed the organization. Davis announced that he was firing Kiffin for cause, meaning he would not have to pay the remainder of his contract. Kiffin sued. The case was eventually settled, but the damage to the Raiders' reputation was irreversible. Lane Kiffin represents the absolute bottom of Raiders coaching history. Not because he was the worst X's and O's coach, though he was bad. Not because he had the worst record, though 5-15 is abysmal. He is number 1 because his tenure represented total organizational dysfunction. The owner and coach at war. The locker room split. The franchise humiliated on national television. It took the Raiders nearly a decade to recover from the chaos that Lane Kiffin's hiring created. And even today, that press conference is shown as an example of how not to run a professional sports franchise. These 10 coaches represent the darkest periods in Raiders history. They are the men who failed when the franchise needed leadership. They are the reasons the Silver and Black spent 20 years in the wilderness. But here is what gives me hope. The Raiders learned from these mistakes. They learned that hiring inexperienced coaches like Kiffin creates chaos. They learned that nostalgia hires like Art Shell do not work. They learned that offensive coordinators like McDaniels do not always translate to head coaching success. The franchise has stability now.
They have learned painful lessons about what works and what does not. But they should never forget the men on this list, because forgetting the past means you are doomed to repeat it. If this countdown made you relive painful memories, if it reminded you of just how bad things got, then subscribe to this channel. We tell Raiders history honestly. We do not sugarcoat the disasters. We remember the failures so we can appreciate the successes. Share this video with any Raiders fan who needs to remember that things could always be worse. Comment below with your least favorite coach from this list. And remember, the silver and black has survived all of these disasters. The franchise is still standing. The tradition endures. Because the Raiders are bigger than any single coach, bigger than any single disaster, bigger than any embarrassment. Just win, baby. Even when a coach has tried their best to make you lose.